May the words of my mouth and the meditations of all our hearts be acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Please be seated. Palm Sunday, as a kid, baffled me. I didn't really get why this was the thing that we chose to reenact, especially considering everything that went on in Jesus' ministry. This is the one that we need to play out and play act. Especially since the emphasis of this service will quickly switch direction with the reading of the Passion, which, having grown up in the church and having the opportunity to be an acolyte from little on up, meant it was the worst Sunday ever to acolyte, because we used to have to process the gospel to the middle aisle and stand there, holding all the things, the torches, the cross, and usually the gospel book, which therefore also made it one of the more memorable Sundays to acolyte, because every so often an acolyte would pass out mid-service. On a particularly memorable occasion, our very old school priest took the gospel bearer as he was starting to waver with one hand and dropped him in an adjacent pew, grabbed the gospel book in the other, and never so much as paused irregularly between the words of the gospel reading. I mean, that's what Jesus would do, right? Ritual above humanity. But I digress. The need to march outside, waving palms, to be a part of the crowd who cheers while then passively listening to the Passion story before we hit Easter, feels like something that requires a little more explanation. Why do we do this ridiculous thing? Especially a ridiculous thing that seems to put us on the side of the winner, to kick off a week that gets bookmarked by celebration, but within it holds the best and the worst of our salvation story and humanity. Well, for starters, we have kept the ritual, but we've lost some of the cultural context. The narrative of the triumphal entry of Jerusalem would have been understood in direct contrast to the regular Roman military entries into towns, particularly towns that were a little troublesome, like places like Jerusalem. These entries were meant to simultaneously impress and threaten. War horses, chariots, the implements and armies of power and death would come riding into the town, helping to signify quite clearly to the people, don't bother trying to rebel. In fact, some historians have hypothesized that such a parade was happening simultaneously on the other side of town. Regardless, this would have been a regular occurrence, one that people would have understood and recognized immediately. Jesus purposefully uses these images and then makes fun of them. Then they brought it to Jesus, the colt, and after throwing their cloaks on the colt, they set Jesus on it. As he rode along, people kept spreading their cloaks on the road. A colt is not a war horse. This is not a parade of intimidation and might, but a protest about the power of God. That's right. This was a protest, which gives a new layer to the Pharisees trying to shut the people up. Teacher, order your disciples to stop. Now, this wasn't a fictitious fear on their part. When the Jews do hatch a revolt some 30 years later, over 100,000 of them are killed, and the Holy Temple is destroyed. But that was part of the point that Jesus was making. This was a protest, not a revolt. It was a protest that was signifying support without being overtly threatening or critical of the oppression of the powers that be. It was a protest which allowed for the anonymity and strikingly limited amount of risk to the crowds. Now, that isn't to say that protests are a bad idea. They have an important place in voicing discontent and are very useful when you have enough mass to educate on your issue and demonstrate the amount of agreement or opposition. But they also aren't everything. There is a reason that Jesus really wasn't a rally organizer. Honestly, the most controversial things that Jesus did wasn't riding on a cult into Jerusalem, but it was who he chose to eat with. Sinners, tax collectors, prostitutes, the poor, the hiding, the desperate, even women. Jesus associated not by class or status, but by the people who wanted to be with him. He helped those who asked. He touched those who threatened to make him unclean just by their presence. And he gave seats of honor to people who were not deemed worthy by other people. Now this was deeply infuriating to the powers that be. He was willing to put himself openly out there on the side of justice in small ways every single day, like calling a tax collector Zacchaeus out of a tree and inviting him to dinner, and also tremendous ways like openly opposing the war machine that was Rome. Now, the people liked it when Jesus was doing it. They didn't like it when it asked more of them than anonymous support. It explains why we do this weird reenactment of a protest that no longer makes sense in our context. The trappings have changed, but the point has not. We like change, but not risk. We want justice, but not at our expense. We want to anonymously be on the winning side, but when our loyalties are called to question, we have a tendency to melt quietly back into the scenery. You know, in the 1960s, over 300,000 people attended Martin Luther King Jr.'s I Have a Dream speech. 70,000 people participated in sit-ins across the South. And some 1,000 people volunteered during Freedom Summer, 4 of which were killed, and 250 faced criminal penalties. It's interesting to note that the numbers dwindle as the ask gets bigger. One minute we are standing and singing Hosanna, and then within the same service, we will hear the backtrackings, the denials, the hiding, from Peter's, "I don't know him," to the crowd's, "Crucify him," to the onlookers, "He saved others, let him save himself." While Jesus was willing to live ministry out loud, letting it dictate his treatment of other people and his lifestyle in such a way as opened him to constant criticism and derision, we are far more conscious of the consequences of our choices. 90% of Jesus' ministry was done one person to one person, serving, feeding, and healing. But when it came down to it, when power came knocking, he answered to it honestly, again and again. What are we actually willing to risk when it comes to oppression and justice? From the homes a town over that were stops on the Underground Railroad, to hiding Jews or smuggling people out under Hitler, to supporting desperate refugees, to advocating for hungry children, for any number of people and groups that still face oppression. What are you willing to risk? And I don't mean that politically. I mean that human to human. It's easy to love or hate people from an anonymous place where we can classify and generalize. And honestly, it leaves us at a Palm Sunday waving our palms and signifying nothing. Where does our fear make us lose our neighbor's humanity? Where does our status quo and ritual mean we are willing to throw you in a pew to the side of ourselves to be handled by others so that we don't miss a beat doing what we think we're supposed to be doing? Palm Sunday doesn't really put us on the side of the winners. It puts us in the moment right before the choice. Will you be ruled by fear or love? Will you side with politics or humans? Will you risk yourself, money, status, reputation, safety, towards standing by the dignity of all human beings? When God gets the choice, God chooses Good Friday. So we've been waving our palms, and we can fade into the crowd, or we can show up at the cross, the one on Friday, and the one we find every day in our communities, with our neighbors, with the vulnerable, with the inconvenient, with the disliked, and yes, even the people who are problematic. The choice is yours. Are you here for the protest, or are you here for the change? Amen.